when we say in adult education, what is education for? It's much better, I think, than what we keep hearing about learning for all, lifelong learning, because we have to ask, what's the purpose? We get a lot of purposes thrown at us, and often they focus on economy and employability. And we have to keep digging and keep asking before we get at the purposes, which have to do with the kinds of things Katrina was talking about, which are getting more at the sort of educating for democracy that we want to talk about today. But we keep hearing first and foremost, adult education is for employability and for economy. It's about how do we step aside from that. But as Katrina also said, we have to ask some pretty deep questions about what do we mean by democracy. This is a baggy term that gets misused in a lot of contexts. So we know it's something to do with freedom, another theme that Katrina really foregrounded. And we know it has something to do with educating in a democratic way as well. Let me just fire things up a bit by taking you to something said back in 1943 by a very prominent leader of adult education, where you can see the timings here with the kind of language, but what we hear is the ambition of democracy is to set men free, men and women, and the ambition of adult education is the same, to set people free from government oppression, materialism. I don't know what the bad taste in living is about, and most of all from the utter drabness of human life, but perhaps it will help you to know that he was Canadian, and he was the director of the Canadian Association for Adult Education, which was an incredibly important movement for us, and particularly when it got formated in the late 30s and until Ned Corbett finished in the 1950s. What I want to do now is look at what I've pulled out as 5 processes that I think characterize adult education for democracy, and I'm going to do it through examples from Canada, only because they're the ones I know best, but certainly I'm inviting you to consider, as you listen to these, the examples you know in the UK. The first one is, as Katrina said, participatory processes, which is not just people's voice. It's the notion that people know important things, and that when people work together, they can figure out almost anything to solve their problems. The example I'll give you is what we call in Canada the anti-Ganesh movement. How many of you have heard of this? Nobody, okay. In Canada, this is one. In Canada, this is one of those traditions that's taught to anybody who is learning education. It was begun in around 1913, and it really came into its own in the 1920s. It was begun in the eastern part of Canada, where people were in dire poverty, fisher folk and farmers. And a lot of the issues was because of the ownership by large companies and middlemen taking a lot of the profits. So what happened was people associated with the university worked with the local folks to organize study clubs. It was all based on study groups, not to talk about their problems, but to analyze the issues, look at what the solutions might be, and develop actions. And the actions were cooperative movements. So they developed cooperative canneries, cooperative banks, and that took off into what eventually became the Canadian credit union movement and cooperative banking, as well as cooperative, spread across Canada as cooperative, all kinds of ways of moving grain. Jimmy Tompkins was the center of this, and his predecessor, Moses Cody. These were the kinds of principles that came out of that movement that you will see really foreshadowed the sort of work that we saw Freire doing later in the 20th century. It wasn't just about voice, it was about activity. People had to put in their time and their effort to learn together. The university was very important in providing the resources that people could mobilize, but then to take action together, which is the social movement thing that Katrina was working on. But social movements are grounded in education. Second principle or characteristic for me of educating for democracies is pedagogies of hope. And this is Freire's own language, of course. But what this is about is everybody being most concerned for those with the least. It is a focus on the least privileged and those at the margins. So the third principle of educating for democracy to me, besides participatory processes and pedagogies of hope, is questions. The deep questions, not about who's included and excluded, but going beyond that. What knowledge counts most? Who has knowledge that's not at the table here? Why aren't we listening to that knowledge? Where does knowledge get valued? And for us in Canada, we have very important teachers of this in the Aboriginal community, Aboriginal First Nations. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, what does this have to do with Scotland? Well, it's just an example for us that's important as Canadians. My guess is when you think hard, there'll be examples in Scotland of groups of people whose knowledge very clearly is not called into the process of thinking through what kind of a society do we want. So a fourth principle of educating for democracy is, of course, the old thing of moving away from people's personal experience of whatever it is, poverty, oppression, persecution, to what are the larger societal systems, political, economic, cultural, and how are those woven together? So that, as Jimmy Tompkins did with the Fisher folk, it's not about how can you make your lives better, but why are you accepting underdevelopment as the way things must be? Why do we have maps like the one Katrina showed us in Glasgow? And what are the systems holding that in place? And that, to me, is what adult education is all about. So essentially, the 5 principles that I've brought about are about these kinds of things: imagining pedagogies of hope, participatory processes, focusing on the less privileged, and definitely linking personal concerns with the broader concerns, which one could summarize as these statements, which I will leave with you as what I've always been, I suppose, inspired by, not in terms of what I read, but in terms of what I see people doing with other people, supported by, not led by, institutions. And there's my let the river run, let the dreamers shake the nations. Thank you very much.